Hi everyone. This week we will be talking about the position of animals in relation to questions of justice and social justice in the environment. Just note that a lot of the material, at least at the beginning of this recording, discusses the work of Jones in his article Animal Rights is a social justice issue. I don't believe this source is part of your reading list this week, but I will post it if anyone is interested. It's just a really great article that explores the concepts relative to this week's topic really well. As Jones has pointed out, despite there being a significant animal rights movement that has existed for a number of decades and been very active in research and scholarship in social justice, the position of animals has largely been absent in most studies and inquiries into social justice, which often takes a larger anthropocentric point of view. Jones, however, argues that the discipline of social justice is significantly disadvantaged by not including the interests of non-human animals and really all sentient beings into the analysis of social justice. And this is because doing so will most likely provide us with a more holistic and less internally contradictory analysis of questions of justice. We have experienced some examples of these contradicting analyses in our discussions and tutorials through exploring anthropocentric perspectives and the sometimes circular resolve that they provide. So why do people do this for people? Why should we do differently to this for people? But we already did it for people in the beginning. So it gets hard to create this linear, logical conclusion or resolution. And so for Jones, those who are committed to social justice should actually care, and so theorize, research, and write about non-human sentient beings of all kinds. Like that discussion we had on the Whitehaven coal mine court case, maybe it would have been more successful if biocentric and ecocentric perspectives were also integrated into that debate, because it would have enhanced and just advantaged the social justice argument. Something that's really important to do before we keep going is to define what is meant by sentient beings in this context. So sentience refers to the understanding, the epistemology, that some entities have life, something that emanates from within them, this life from within them. And this often includes features like the capacity for pain or suffering, enjoyment, desire, and broadly the capacity to be motivated by something and act on it, which impacts the world in some way. And this action also shows the being's desire to influence the world in ways that meet their needs or their wants. And this capacity to act on the world in a preferred way is key for defining that non-human entity quality. So looking at the question of sentience and whether we should include all sentient beings, so including non-human animals, into the questions of social justice, Jones reminds us about the root of the idea of justice. So he argues that non-human animals should be part of these concerns, because typically when we say something is unjust, it is when we are saying that something or someone has been treated in a way that they do not deserve, that something is not in line with their intrinsic value and worth. So Jones argues that injustice or justice in this context should then naturally account for non-human animals, because when we look at the simple inhumane treatment of animals, for example, we would say that they have been treated in a way that does not respect their inherent or intrinsic value, and it does not reflect the treatment that they do deserve. But what about social justice for animals? Should we think of it as part of our human study and search for social justice? The term social justice often refers primarily to justice for humans, and that does make sense, social being the kind of key word. But for Jones, the question actually comes down to that very word, the idea of society. So social justice concerns itself with justice for and within society, and those who are a part of a society and the structural mechanisms that create the society, including the parts that create unfair treatment for other beings. So for Jones, the extended view of society, not limited just to humans, is more accurate, as our societies do not only include humans. If we look at our economic systems, non-human animals are largely incorporated within that social system. So Jones is really developing a reasonable or logical, broadened conceptualization of society that is designed to help us see animal justice as quite a natural part of social justice. But this is rather confusing, particularly the first time you hear it, because we still have questions like, are some of the foundational frameworks we have for understanding social justice for humans even relevant to non-human animals? And Jones does argue yes. So Jones takes, for example, the 5 faces of oppression and claims that if we look at non-human animals, particularly in industrialized food production and general commodity goods production spheres, we see that the 5 faces of oppression that can be applied to humans can be perfectly applied to non-human animals in this context. 3 of the 5 faces of oppression, I should point out, again include exploitation, marginalization, and powerlessness. As we know from early Marxist analysis, focus on the ways in which humans are systematically exploited for the interest and benefits of others. And we're going to focus on those 3 for now, and I'll identify the next 2 in the next slide. So Jones argues that exploitation applies to non-human animals. Their bodies are used for labor, food, clothing, research, and sources of entertainment. Next, if we look at notions of marginalization and powerlessness, Jones argues that non-human animals are routinely subjected to these material and social conditions in which they are deprived of recognition or respect for their inherent value. So they are deprived of opportunities to be the creatures they were created to be, to act in accordance with their own instincts, desires, and ways of being. They are deprived of any opportunity to live in the way that is coherent with their nature. And if we saw this happening to human beings, we would call it a severe form of marginalization and powerlessness. So Jones argues this idea of severe marginalization is the case for many non-human animals. They can be deprived of the ability to express species-specific behaviors and capabilities, and in conditions where they lack autonomy or respectful treatment, they are powerlessness to alter their situation. And in the wild, non-human animals might have the capacity to act on their environment in certain ways, even if they are subject to predators by other animals, being prey of other animals. But in the context of industrialized food production, a social and unnatural system, they are put in positions of abject powerlessness, meaning powerlessness to act in their own interests. The last 2 faces of the 5 faces of oppression are cultural imperialism and violence. So in terms of cultural imperialism, Jones argues that if we look at the way the world is structured, all systems and institutions are structured around the human point of view, to the exclusion of others, really. So you know now this is called an anthropocentric view, where everything is centered around humans, our culture, our beliefs, and our practices. And of course, there are multiple beliefs and cultures amongst humans too, including ones that are not anthropocentric, but largely the human worldview or human focus tends to be dominant in the world. Certainly in Western cultural ideologies and practices, there is a tremendous tradition for cultural imperialism, where humans are positioned as a dominant species and all others are seen as other and need to conform to the majority ideology and follow the practices. Finally, violence. So Jones points out the variety and degree of violence routinely perpetrated against non-human animals, which some of which is really hard to understand because it's just so horrid, I suppose. Like, even these images in the slides are really hard. But this was part of the reading for this week and is something we'll talk about more in class. But for now, it is sufficient to say that any research in the treatment of animals in food production processes would reveal, as Jones says, an unspeakable level of violence that is not by exemption, but quite routine and everyday. And certainly Waddiwell agrees with this, particularly around factory farming and industrialized slaughter technologies, calling it a monstrous deployment of technologies of violence and extermination. The scale of death and suffering defies imagination, really, and the statistics, like I'll say in class as well, they're really hard to comprehend. Now, of course, there are those who claim that reduced sentience amongst non-human animals, perhaps even non-sentience, justifies some of this violent treatment and also the associated forms of marginalization and oppression. For instance, there is often a hierarchy of species where some are ventrified, like horses, and regarded as more sentient, while pigs are less so and fish are even less so. And this is the same hierarchy we often see under speciesism, which is important to remember. It's social and cultural because it isn't really a normal thing. It's not an inherent thing to have this hierarchy. Children, for example, do not inherently know or come up with this hierarchy. Another example of this being normalized in society is that we see different cultures placing importance and unimportance on different species in different ways. So animals commonly used for meat in one culture are seen as divine in another culture. However, there are a range of scholars and activists who challenge the argument that the non-sentience or reduced sentience of a non-human animal just exists. So, for example, Comstock, I hope that's how you pronounce their name, evaluates neurobiological and behavioral evidence showing that cows do feel pain. So not just as an instinctive reaction to stimuli, but as an actual experience of pain. They don't just act instinctively, but also in a service of a particular desire, so showing a reflective action. So seeking joy, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, just like humans do as well. They also have memories and preferences, and they have long memories of pain and seeking pleasure. And this builds the case for a full sentience of many non-human animals that we routinely slaughter and exploit. Some, like Waddiwell, who is the author of the source that's part of your weekly reading for this week, have taken this further to look at species that aren't often regarded as sentient, like fish. So fish are often seen largely as instinctive creatures without real feelings, agency, or sentience. And Waddiwell challenges this assumption and asks a different question. So can fish resist? A big part of what we think of as part of humanity, besides the ability to feel love and pain and pleasure, and to have memories, is our ability to demonstrate agency, so to act on the world in a certain way that advances what we want and to avoid what we don't want. And agency is often seen as a real sign of sentience, like we've said. So Waddiwell argues that if we look closely, fish show this consciousness in a way that they resist capture and practices designed to restrain or harm them. So for instance, when looking at the tradition of a fishing hook, the traditional fishing hook, the design of the hook symbolizes, perhaps unconsciously even, the recognition that fish do not want to be caught. So the hook is designed to trick the fish, and once they are hooked, and once they engage in more resistance, the more embedded the hook becomes in them. And Waddiwell takes a politicalized stance on this and argues that animal resistance to capture and treatment by humans should be seen as intentional acts of subordination against human domination. So non-human animals are actually showing that they resist our domination, and their resistance is a sign that they wish not to be dominated. And this means the increasingly technical systems designed to control animals, to enclose them and to subdue them, are a form of confession or recognition that we know that they are resisting. It's only because animals resist, because they do not want to give themselves up without resistance, that there are these technologies that exist and are over time refined in the ways that they have been. So fish farming is another example of this. In recognition that fish will resist capture in the wild, these really complex methods are used to restrain them in, control their behavior, and then make them easier to capture. And this raises some really interesting and provocative questions about whether we should, and even how, animals might be given the same kind of moral distinction and support that humans do. On what basis, I suppose, and what does this mean for human practices and their relation with non-human animals? And we will explore this more, but this is kind of where those questions are starting to pop up. Like I said, we will talk more about that in class, and your weekly reading also talks a lot about that for this week. So I very much recommend that you do your reading.